So first of all, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining us for the second webinar in our three-part series on the International Student Lifecycle, which Nebi is delighted to co-host with the Global Alliance for International Student Advancement, or Gaiza, the New England Council, and the New Hampshire College and University Council. And since we have the co-founder or the founding president of Gaiza with us today, I thought I would turn it over to Rich to give us a quick about Gaiza.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and welcome to all of you who are watching. Gaiza is a new 501c3 that was started last year, and we are a group, and certainly you're going to hear from one of our council members in a minute, who's also a panelist. We're a group of international education folks, student affairs folks, and DEI folks that are really looking at the intersectionality for international student success. And part of that is, being part of these types of webinars, and really the strength comes from our board members and our council members. So we're really excited to co-host this event with you.
All right, great. Thanks, Rich. So in the first episode of our series, we discussed the evolving federal policy landscape, as well as some challenges and opportunities associated with international student recruitment now and post-COVID. And we shared some strategies for engaging with international students throughout the recruitment process. Today, we'll look past the recruitment phase, and we'll dive deeper into what institutions can do for international students once they've enrolled and are on campus. Our panelists will survey effective strategies for addressing international students' unique needs and mitigating retention challenges. And as was the case with the first webinar, please feel free to ask questions at any time in the Q&A box. My colleague Stafford Pete will be monitoring that box and will ask your questions throughout the discussion. We will also leave time at the end for audience questions. For those of you who don't already know me, I am Stephanie Murphy, the Associate Director of Policy at the New England Board of Higher Education, and I will be moderating today's session. And I thank you all for being with us. As a quick reminder, today's meeting is on the record, and the video will be shared with registrants in a post-event email, so keep an eye out for that. We are delighted to have our esteemed panelists with us today. We have Dr. Robin Helms, who's the Assistant Vice President for Learning and Engagement at the American Council on Education. Her portfolio includes the Internationalization Laboratory and Learner Success Lab, Professional Learning Program and Development, and ACE's International Research Agenda. Dr. Rich DeCapua, who we just heard from, is the founding president of our partner for this series, Gaiza, which, as you mentioned, is a nonprofit organization that seeks to build a new model for international student success in higher education. Prior to founding Gaiza, Rich was the Associate Dean of Students at Boston College, and he has nearly 2 decades of experience in higher education, including leadership roles at Suffolk, Wesleyan, and Brandeis. Dr. Gerardo Blanco is Associate Professor of Higher Education and Academic Director at the Center for International Education at Boston College. His work explores the intersections of quality and internationalization in higher education. His teaching, research, and consulting have taken place in 15 countries and 5 continents. In 2019, he served as advisor to the Higher Education Commission of Pakistan on the development of its national framework for quality assurance. And last but not least, we have Dr. Linda Sarah Hagedorn, who's the Professor Emeritus at the School of Education at Iowa State University and the former Associate Dean of Undergraduate Programs, International Programs, Student Services, Diversity, and Community at Iowa State University. She's a prominent researcher in the area of community college student success with over 200 publications and presentations. And throughout her career, she's been highly involved in higher international education. In partnership with the U.S. Department of State, she was the American Director of 2 American Cultural Centers in China. So panelists, thank you so much for being with us today. Now, Robin, I want to begin with a question for you. You co-authored an ACE report that was recently released on the international student lifecycle, much like the lifecycle that we're covering throughout our webinar series. on their time before arriving on campus, their time during their studies, and then the period following graduation. One of the key elements of ACE's report is a proposed model for international student inclusion and success. And as I mentioned just a few moments ago, our first webinar focused on the before stage of the life cycle. Today, we turn our attention to the during phase and the question of how to support international student success once they've enrolled and arrived on campus. Robin, could you kick us off by giving us a high-level overview of ACE's model, including the philosophy behind it, and talk a little bit about some of the essential elements of inclusion and success while international students are studying at their institution?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here with you today. I am going to share my screen so you get a little bit of a visual. Whoops, hold on, wrong screen. You'd think after a year I would be getting this right. Okay, there we go. Looks okay?
Looks great.
All right, excellent. Okay, well, as Stephanie mentioned, we released a new report from ACE in February called Toward Greater Inclusion and Success, a new compact for international students. And I'll start with a little bit of background about the study and the report that resulted from that study. So one of my favorite things about this project was that it was actually initiated by an international student, a graduate research associate who was working with us at ACE a couple of years ago. And she saw the need for this project based on what she saw in her own research in the literature on international student success, as well as her own experience. So the challenge that we found was that there is a lot of great research on international student experiences, but it's often focused on one particular aspect of the student experience. So for example, right when they arrive on campus, or career development, or what's happening in the classroom, or a particular population of international students. So maybe students from a particular country. And we saw that what was needed really is a broad view of cross-cutting themes across all of that research and good practices across the whole student experience, from recruiting all the way through when students graduate and go on into the workforce and on with their lives. So our approach in this project was to do a comprehensive review of the research literature and bring together the big picture. So again, these key themes that are really underpinning all aspects of the international student experience, with practical strategies. So looking at what works for campuses and what's really leading to greater inclusion and success for students. And our approach was holistic. So we're looking at the full student life cycle, including actually that recruiting stage, all the way through their time on campus and then through when they're alumni. And we propose a campus-wide approach. So recognizing that international student success is not the purview of one particular office or one particular staff member, but it really requires a commitment by the entire institution. The project is also framed by current issues and challenges. So a lot of credit goes to the primary authors on the report, Chris Glass and Kara Godwin, for taking into account what's happening right now. So there's a big focus, as the title suggests, on diversity and inclusion. We address racial justice issues and COVID impacts, and concerns about numbers or an overemphasis on the number of students as well. So I think one thing that we've seen in the last year, when we've had fewer international students on campus, is a lot of conversation about the importance of international students, but it's often framed around getting more students to campus, bringing more students, the tuition dollars that they bring. And so we really wanted to expand that conversation and refocus it on inclusion and success. So as Stephanie mentioned, the result of this project was the ACE model for international student inclusion and success. And this is all the report, and all this information is available on our website, and I'll pop a link into the chat in just a bit. But the model, again, much more detail in the report, but just a few key aspects of the model. It's grounded in global needs and challenges. So this is the foundation piece. So looking at sustainability, responsiveness, networks, humanism, equity, concepts that really underpin the challenges we're facing in the world right now, and applying that lens to our approaches to international student success. It's outcomes focused, so it answers the why question, and this is the vision part of the framework. So why are we wanting to bring students to campus? Thinking about outcomes for students, for institutions, and for society as a whole. It provides practical strategies for implementation, and this is the framework section of the model. And this is really kind of the meat of the report in many ways. So some of those big themes that we found as we looked across the research literature included interconnected networks, sense of belonging, engaged learning, life and career pathways. And so in the report, we really dig into those areas and look at all the different ways that institutions can support student success in all of those ways. And then finally, recruiting and decision factors are intentionally framed as the last step in our model. So that's the launch part. So it's really recognizing that institutions need to be thinking about the foundation, the vision, the framework, all of these pieces before they're even thinking about bringing students to campus. And just a few more things about our model as we move to the rest of the conversation today and how we bring kind of theory to practice. So we recognize that this model is disruptive. It's counter to the consumer and market approach. It's counter to the let's bring international students to campus because they're going to pay our tuition. It calls out a gap between rhetoric and reality of the level of success that students are experiencing at this point and the levels of support they're getting. And it's intentionally trying to reorient that narrative, again, away from the numbers, but really thinking about what it means to include students on campus and what it means to prepare them for the rest of their lives. It's multifaceted, so it covers all aspects of the student identity and the student experience, again, recruiting all the way through when they're alumni, and again, recognizing that it's not just one office, that this is a responsibility for the whole campus, and we want to be engaging beyond the campus as well. And it's transformational, so we're reframing these transactional approaches. Students pay tuition, and then they graduate, and we send them on their way. To really much more of a relationship focus, requiring dedication and commitment over time. And we recognize it's a pretty tall order for campuses. This report is 80 pages. There's a lot to take in and digest. And so really for ACE, some of our next steps are learning what this means for campuses. Part of that is the conversation we'll have today. What's already happening on campuses? What are we doing well? And what does need to change? And then ACE hopes to provide support for implementation as well through some of our own programs like the Internationalization Laboratory, and then additional research and good practices that build on this work. So I'll just mention again the report, and we actually have a presentation video that talks in a little more detail about the findings available on our website, and I'll pop that into the chat in just a moment and turn it back over to Stephanie. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Robin. And we will share the report and that video in the post-event follow-up email as well. So folks will have plenty of chances to take a look at that. And we'll come back to you, Robin, throughout our chat today. But if anybody has any questions, you want to dig deeper into any of the things that Robin just mentioned, feel free to type those in the Q&A box and we will get those questions asked. So Robin, we'll come back to you, but Rich, I want to turn over to you now. Given your experience, your years of experience as a student affairs professional on campus, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what are some of the challenges that you've seen with international students, and maybe tell us about some of the missed opportunities that you've seen.
Sure, definitely. And I appreciate the question. And I think I'm going to echo from Robin, that report laying out that offices have to work together for international student success and support. And too often, international students come in through admissions, and then it's international education or the scholars office that has them, and they're moved throughout the entire campus in these kind of pockets. And we need to revisit what that looks like in terms of the intentionality for their success across all offices. There's a lot that I could go over, but I think the number one issue from a student affairs, student service standpoint is you have a population of students that have been traumatized. I mean, we all have because of COVID, right? But this is an especially vulnerable population. And so many campuses want to start the fall semester and get back to normal, right? We want people back on campus, and we just can't do that. We have to think strategically on how are we going to onboard international students from now, work with them throughout the summer. Hopefully they're here in the fall to really talk about what their experiences have been. And certainly counseling offices are looking at what do we have to do to scale services. One of the research reports that we're working on right now is the intersection of mental health issues, international students, and telehealth, and what that looks like. Because international students do tend to like doing that more, right? They like it online. It's a great service. So how do we continue doing those things? And again, to echo back with Robin is, and my student affairs colleagues and I talk about this all the time. If COVID didn't happen, but all of the racial justice issues were happening, what would we have done if students were on campus to really engage international students on what things like white supremacy, racism, xenophobia, what does that look like, especially since so many of the international students that come to the United States are coming from monoethnic countries, right? So there's a big learning curve there. And I don't think higher ed has done as well as we could to figure out how to engage students around this. And I'll say one last thing. I know everybody who's listening to this and anybody who is on campus right now are exhausted. They are spent. It has been an extremely difficult year and a half, but if we're gonna really help this population, it's now to start thinking about this. It can't just be, we go back to the regular orientation sessions and programming without really, you can't sidestep what has happened. So how are we engaging directly?
Great, thanks, Rich. And I'll come back to you for a follow-up question in just a minute, but I want to turn it quickly to Gerardo because you come at this issue from a slightly different perspective. You come at this from a global or a comparative perspective. In your view, what are some of the needs that impact international students and what are some promising interventions?
Absolutely. So I think in my role, actually dual role in this session, first supporting the really important work that Gaiza is doing, but also as I serve as the academic director for the Center for International Higher Education. One of the things that we do in the center is having this network of colleagues who can really look at these issues we are discussing from a global perspective, right? And I think one of the first things to keep in mind is that we are not the only country that has international students. And I think it has been really important to look, for instance, well, we know very clearly the majority of international students in the United States come from China. Well, we have the ability to look at what does the experience of international students in China looks like. And what's really fascinating is that they encounter some very similar challenges. For instance, in the early stages of the COVID crisis in China, their international students from Africa were experiencing instances of discrimination because there was misinformation distributed through social media saying that it was migrant workers from Africa that were spreading COVID across China, right? So it's in a way, some of the themes sound quite familiar or should sound familiar to us, right? There is so much that we can learn. On the other hand, when we look also at the experience in Australia, and in some ways, Australian universities, well, they're a lot more reliant on international students for exactly the same reasons that Robin was referring to, the thinking of international students as sources of revenue, and doing so quite openly and quite strategically. And I think the Australian higher education system has been under tremendous distress during the COVID crisis, and they continue to be. So I think these are just two very quick examples of some of the challenges, right, that we are encountering here, and therefore that we can learn from. I think certainly one of the vulnerabilities that the crisis has exposed is that simply how unsustainable this model of thinking of international students only as sources of revenue is. It just isn't. And if we continue in the current path, we are going to be in tremendous trouble. One could say we already are, and perhaps there have been some responses to alleviate some of the challenges. The one idea that I would like to plant for this group is perhaps that one of the most researched topics around international students is this notion of integration, right? We, of course, want them to be part of the campus community. However, I would argue that there is perhaps an unintended sort of negative side of not the experience of integrating international students, but how we think of that process. And frankly, we often talk about integration when what we really mean is the assimilation of international students into our existing academic cultures, institutional patterns, and so on. And I think we need to reimagine what this integration means so that it's not an equivalent to this assimilation, but rather we transform our institutions so that they can be better spaces in general for these internationally mobile academic workforce of the future, right? And I think that's the invitation that I'm sure we can continue discussing. How do we move this concept of integration forward, right? So that it's not just, well, it's on the international students to adapt, but rather how do we change? Because I really think being open to that transformation can really lead to significant improvements in our colleges and universities.
Fantastic. And I completely agree that that transformation of the campus is absolutely key. And I'm going to ask you guys all a question about that a little bit later. So we'll go into that a little bit further. But for right now, I want to ask a follow-up question to you, Gerardo. Many institutions, current services, and programs can themselves be viewed as retention tools. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about what programs and services are available that focus on international student retention. And if there are any model programs or services here in New England that you could tell us about, and tell us about the ways that these services and programs support international student retention.
Right. I mean, I think there is no shortage of these examples. Perhaps for me, just kind of given my background professionally and academically, one that really comes to mind is sort of the work that living learning communities that have an international orientation could have. And one of the most transformational experience I had in my career was serving as the faculty director of something called Global House at the University of Connecticut, where I was working at until recently. And I really thought, sort of, first of all, this is so important that we don't reinvent the wheel, right? Like, we know that living and learning communities, as well as global learning, are considered what we call high impact practices. Maybe I would say more like practices that have a high potential for impact, right? Because it's a promise. It's not necessarily something that we know it's going to work. But one of the great things of that kind of approach of living learning communities was that I was first and foremost a faculty member who happened to have a passion for international education. And then I was part of a team working with a residence hall director, with graduate students, with resident assistants, right? And the idea was to offer programming, but it really wasn't just these two. I mean, first of all, just bringing student affairs and academic affairs was a triumph in itself, but something that was really powerful for the students and for the work that we were doing is that the whole division of global affairs was involved, particularly the Office of International Students and Scholars. So it was really great that the living learning community was located just across the hallway to the International Students and Scholars Office. So whenever the students had a question that they felt comfortable maybe asking the resident assistant, there could be that referral, right? Of course, all of these, and also having faculty involved, because part of this, I was not aware just how challenging some of the things we take for granted were. Just to give you one very quick example and to wrap up with that, I was talking with some of our international students about going to office hours. And then we got into the conversation, and I learned that some of the students rehearsed the questions that they were going to ask to a faculty member the following day, right? So things that we take for granted when we say, well, my door is open, you can come in, that is such a big climb for some of our students, right? They are often not so confident in their spoken English skills. They don't always feel included. They don't always feel adequate, right? So some of the things that we really take for granted are such a challenge. And I thought that was such an eye-opening experience for me. And I have to say, I was an international student. I came to the United States as an international student. And I really think I needed this reminder. I needed to be reminded by the students that many of the things that I have learned and adapted to continue to be a challenge, right? And I think we all need to take this empathetic and even, as Rich was saying quite adequately, we really should take a trauma-informed approach, right, in the work that we do. And that definitely should be something that we keep in mind as we prepare for continuing in the fall semester.
Great. Thank you so much, Gerardo. Rich, I want to give you a chance to follow up on that with your perspective. From your view, who's leading the effort and who's doing it well? And we've already mentioned that, everyone on campus needs to be involved. It's not just, one group or another. Who does need to be involved, and how do the different roles on campus come together to take care of international students?
Well, it's a heck of a question, because you could probably ask people on their home campus, who's in charge of this, and they'll probably say another office, right? But it's everybody's responsibility to do this. And I think bringing people together right now. So for me, it's admissions, it's advancement, it's student affairs, it's faculty, it's everybody, right? They're all touching these students in different ways. So to really get a sense of what's happening, you have to be able to bring folks to the table and be able to share information about what these experiences look like. I think the interesting thing that has happened in higher education, the rise of chief diversity officers in those offices, all of a sudden international education is kind of, sometimes it's being shifted over there. And these are typically places at the institution that are under-resourced, right? It's usually one person who has said, you're going to lead all these efforts for the institution without having the adequate funding or staffing to actually do it. And I'm finding for most of my colleagues that international student success is being shifted under that umbrella as well. So all institutions probably have to relook at, okay, who actually owns the journey? And probably it's going to be multiple offices working together to do that. Of course, I'm always advocating for the student affairs folks who sometimes aren't at the table when they should be, and they have direct access and direct support of international students in ways that most other folks don't think of. So that would probably be my perspective right now. But the trauma-informed lens, just for me as a student affairs person, is what hangs in my heart like the most right now. And folks should really be thinking of it.
Absolutely agree. All right, now, Linda, we haven't heard from you yet, so I want to turn it over to you now. Conversations on international students tend to focus on the four-year institutions. We've been focused pretty much on four-year institutions so far in our conversation right now, and we tend to leave the community colleges out of the equation. And in many ways, this does make sense. Community colleges were developed for Americans as a low-cost opportunity to extend the education of local high school students. But Linda, you haven't forgotten about community colleges. You've done the important work of researching international students in community colleges. Could you start by telling us about some of the reasons why international students choose to enroll in community colleges, as well as some of the benefits that this population brings to community colleges?
Sure. Thank you so much for letting me speak on this important topic. And indeed, I think we often do not consider international students attending community colleges, but indeed they do. And right now there are about 80,000 students, international students in community colleges. I'm going to share my screen for just a second and show you some numbers. Okay, here we are. This chart shows the number of international students at community colleges, and you see by various years. As I indicated earlier, there's close to 80,000 students right now in the United States. And that number may not seem that high, but indeed it does represent about 7.4% of all international students here in the United States that are attending, at least in part, community colleges. Now the numbers are declining a little bit, as they're declining throughout all of the different types of post-secondary education. And the numbers are really, really small, even among community colleges. So international students only represent about 1.1% of all community college students, but they're an important group. And I also thought I would show you which colleges are getting the largest share of community college students. And although Texas seems to be the number one, but the rest of the colleges in the top 10 are all coastal. And usually represent areas that international people are well aware of, so larger cities. But a lot of my work has been done with smaller community colleges that have smaller numbers, and typically in places where the cost of living may be a little less. All right, I'll stop sharing at this point. So let me tell you a little bit about why community colleges are attractive to students and why they come. I want to tell you that students will come to community colleges for many of the same reasons that American students go to community colleges. Starting out with, perhaps they couldn't get accepted into their number one choice of institution. Now, normally that means they probably couldn't get into their top institution in their own country. And so coming to the US kind of releases some of that pressure. And if in fact they had maybe perhaps some academic difficulty, or the number one reason is not being sufficiently able in English. And so many community colleges have intensive English programs. And of course, with the open admissions process of many community colleges, students can come with low TOEFL scores. If they're able, they can mix academic courses with English as a second language course. And so kind of beginning that slower process of gaining credits toward a baccalaureate. But you know, when we think about international students in community colleges, I want to really inform our listeners that it's not just students coming directly from high school into the community college as a full-time process. In fact, the majority of international students at community colleges use these colleges in different ways. And I talk about them as rescues. But students who come to the US and you know, they may have high TOEFL scores, they may have high SAT scores and other high academics, but once they get here, it's not that easy. And some students get themselves into trouble from a GPA standpoint. And there are a number of students who actually transfer into the community colleges from the four-year institution, perhaps for a semester, perhaps longer, because they may get more attention at a community college, smaller classes, and faculty that may in fact have more time because they're not dedicated to research. Many community international students will take a course or two at a community college. And the number one course that they take is speech. Because the fear of getting up and making a speech in English is often very difficult. And so many of them will just take even just that one course and transfer it back. But they use the community college for that rescue. And I think we'd also be surprised at how many international students may sign up for a few courses at the community college in addition to their full load at a four-year institution, because time is money. And international students want to finish in those 4 years. So because they're relying on their parents or their family members to get them through. And if it's taking them longer, they may not have sufficient funding to do that. And another real prevalent way that many international students use community colleges is for the second 8-week courses. And let me explain what that is. And some at many community colleges, they'll offer some courses in kind of in a way that you could take it for the first 8 weeks of a semester, and then take another course the second 8 weeks of that semester. So it's kind of a way to kind of get through faster. If community college, or if international students at four-year institutions have a problem with a course and they have to drop it, or they fear they're going to fail a course and they drop it, remember they have to stay enrolled full-time to stay in the US. And many of those students will then sign up for that second 8-week semester course to kind of keep on the full-time track. You asked me about benefits. Well, you know, community college students, international students bring benefits to all kinds of financial benefits to all the institutions that they attend. So certainly financial, and it's not just the tuition that they pay, but in community colleges that are public institutions, they pay the full freight. For instance, at Santa Monica Community College, which is a very large college in LA area, the tuition that the international students pay is 8 times that of the residential student. At Kirkwood Community College in Iowa, they pay twice the amount of tuition. So, you know, that's a fact. But they also buy books, they also buy food on campus, and some community colleges do have resident homes for international students. But of course, they bring diversity, they bring awareness, and international students and their families always benefit the United States economy. They increase global understanding, and ultimately, they lead to a brighter future for our globalized world. I think I'll stop there.
Linda, one of the data you've just shared on community colleges has prompted one of our listeners to ask this question. Is there any research done on international graduate students? And I think, I feel free, other members of the panel, to point to any research that might have been done that would be helpful.
Well, sure. I mean, graduate international students, the majority of our international students who come here are graduate students studying at the master and doctoral level. But I'll leave that to my other colleagues, because that would not cross over into the community college sector.
I'll jump in for a moment. We definitely, in our report, cover the graduate student experience also, and that acknowledgement that there are different needs for graduate students, certainly, than undergraduate students, and we dig into that somewhat in our report. The other ACE research that I would mention is our Mapping Internationalization on U.S. Campuses study. So this is a survey that we do throughout the U.S. every 5 years, most recently in 2016, where it's a pretty broad sort of 30,000 feet view of internationalization. So we do include questions in that around graduate student recruiting, international graduate student recruiting efforts, and touch on that in that survey as well. So that report's on our website. We are actually, right now, that survey's in the field for 2021 with some COVID nuances and other pieces to it as well. So more data to come fairly shortly.
And I think just to add to the question, right, because one thing is, of course, the awareness about these enrollments, which is very, very important. But I think some of the challenges that we have been discussed about sort of the need for coordination, it's just so important here, right? Because at the graduate level, often this is exacerbated, right? We often think about offices of diversity and inclusion, as well as student affairs and student services, as serving primarily undergraduate students, right? And in a way, traditionally, graduate advising has been the purview of faculty, often the sole supervisor, right, who oversees the research. And this is where some of the very challenging examples that we often read in the media, right? Often we read about the worst of these experiences of issues of research integrity, of oftentimes harassment, or simply issues of negative experiences, right? Because I'll speak for myself as an academic and as a dissertation supervisor and all those roles. I have never received any kind of formal training to work with international students. And I studied in a very friendly field of higher education, right? So I can only imagine that many of our colleagues in other fields feel completely not fully equipped, right, to work with international students, because it really takes not only a mindset, but a set of skills. And I think that's just a very important missing piece at the moment.
Great, thanks. And thanks to the person who asked that question. Feel free to plug in your questions in the Q&A, and we will start getting to those shortly. Before we do, Linda, I have a follow-up question for you based on what you said. You concluded your remarks by going through some of the ways that international students are important at community colleges. And given their importance at community colleges, I'm wondering if you could tell us what community colleges can do to attract and serve international students to their campus. And what are some of the key steps for community colleges to consider? And maybe if you could share some practices that are already at place at community colleges that could be modeled elsewhere that might be helpful for our region.
Sure. Colleges that have higher levels of international students, they recruit them. And recruitment is important with any student group. I recommend that when colleges are considering recruitment, that they target specific countries so that they're able and ready to address the needs of those types of students. Their Education USA. Education USA is run by the U.S. Department of State. And I have worked with Education USA and various embassies across the world. And this is an agency of the U.S. Department of State that informs students of how to be an international student, how to enroll in colleges and universities. And if community colleges want international students, they need to work with Education USA and provide their information about how the college can help their students, how their students might benefit. You have to make it easy for students to come to your college. So that requires having a international office, or at least an international officer at the community colleges. And many don't have those that help the student to aid them from from the time of getting a visa through their entire stay at the college. But one of the biggest obstacles to recruiting community college students internationally is a lack of knowledge in these countries about what community colleges are and the role of transfer. The United States is unique, with the exception of perhaps Canada, in terms of having a system where students can start at one college and transfer to another. In most countries, the idea of transfer is just something unheard of. If you don't make it in college one, that's it. But the idea of the second chance, and well as the transfer, is something that is really foreign to students and their families. So having a way through Education USA or through other recruitment exercises to really explain that transfer piece is extremely important. Now, in terms of best practices, there are many colleges, community colleges in the country or I should say some community colleges in the country, that have what we call admissions partnership programs. Specific partnerships between a community college and a four-year institution that makes that transfer for internationals much smoother, and the planning begins when the student comes to the community college. These transfer partnerships, I'll point to Des Moines Area Community College and Iowa State University is one set. In other words, students are recruited to start at Des Moines, and they know when they come here that they're going to be going to Iowa State. Now, Iowa State doesn't have to give these students anything, except to say, if your GPA is at a certain level from the community college. You've gone your 2 years and you've earned X number of credits, and that your English, your TOEFL score is at a certain level, that you will be accepted into Iowa State. And so those students come here knowing that not only are they going to the community college, they're going into a program that will lead to a baccalaureate degree from that 4-year institution. Other excellent partnerships are with the George Mason University and the Northern Area Community College in Washington, D.C. Maricopa Community College in Arizona State has another one, and there are many others. I mean, these are ones that I've worked with specifically, so I'm more knowledgeable about them. So, having this plan and dealing with students when they're still in the community college. And as I said before, working with Education USA, and if I kind of return just real quickly to recruitment, many of the community colleges that have higher numbers of community college, international community college students, they not only deal with Education USA, the top ones also sometimes deal with education agents, private institutions. Now that can be very controversial. And I'm not here to say that that should be done. I'm just pointing out this is what occurs. And that getting that practice together is extremely important for educating families. Make sure that the websites of these colleges may not only be in English. There are many options for other languages, because it's not just the students that are looking, the parents and families are, and they may not be able to read in English. So community colleges do recruit. They do want these students. And as enrollments go down in community colleges and elsewhere, opening up to these newer or other student pools becomes more and more important.
Great, thank you, Linda. So we're about to turn it over to our audience for open Q&A. So if you have any questions, be sure to put them into the Q&A box and we will ask those questions shortly. While folks are getting their questions in, I have a question that I want to turn over to all of our panelists. And this touches on an angle about the side of institutions making the change rather than the students that we talked about earlier. We've heard from enrollment managers in New England that a few things that international students consider when deciding whether to study in the US and where to study include a number of things like college rankings, price. We've talked about how international students pay full price, but of course, not all international students fit the mold of the high-paying student. Price is just as important to international students as it is for domestic students. So we've got rankings, price, return on investment and job placement rate post-graduation. Additionally, international students seriously consider an institution's program offerings, particularly in global interest areas such as climate change, AI, and so on. So my question for all of you is, how can institutions internationalize their curricula to attract and retain international students? And how can we collect data and use data to expand education in global interest areas to offer programs that better appeal to international students? Robin, do you want to kick us off with that?
Sure, I'm happy to start with that. There's a lot in that question. It's great. Thank you. I would actually pick up on something that Linda said about the importance of planning and really talking through with students what a course path is going to look like and within the curriculum and helping them understand sort of where they're going. But I think one of the strengths of the U.S. higher education system is this opportunity to try different things in different areas. So really kind of talking about the breadth of the curriculum and helping students understand how they can try different things, how these things fit together without over planning their track as well. So if we have students coming in and really wanting, I want to major in this and this is my plan, that's fine. Again, encouraging that exploration, but encouraging them maybe the use of the co-curriculum as a place to explore other interests as well. And then helping students articulate these experiences as they're thinking about their positions and their career development also. So thinking through, again, what are all the different aspects of the educational experience inside and outside the classroom that can get students onto the path where they want to be.
Great. Rich, Gerardo, Linda, do any of you want to take it from there?
Well, I definitely think that internationalization of the curriculum is one of those aspects that we need to contend with in a much more serious way. I mean, I think, and I think, for example, right, like the most, I think sort of we either can see it as a great opportunity or as an extremely depressing exercise is to just select at random a series of syllabi from any courses in our college campuses and look at the references and the required readings and just do a very quick overview of where are the scholars that our students are reading located. And I would guess that an incredible majority would be from other US scholars. The choices that we make as faculty members matter, right? And I think that's perhaps one of the most basic, but also most attainable aspects of internationalizing the curriculum. What are we assigning? What are we suggesting to students that they should read? Another, speaking of practices that have become quite popular and I would say quite beneficial in many cases, many institutions do a common read for incoming students, right? And everybody does the same reading. So why not engaging through that exercise with work that is coming or writing from a perspective outside of the United States? I mean, I think this idea of infusing global perspectives in everything that we do is very important, right? And how also do we celebrate other forms of mobility, right? Like how do we think about like migrant and refugee students, for instance, as also sources of internationalization on our campuses? And I really think this dichotomy of international students as being those that hold a particular type of visa and really thinking more about student backgrounds and what do they contribute to our institution's community, I think that's also another way to rethink or reimagine some of the work that we do.
Great, Rich.
And I'll speak to community colleges in terms of internationalization, because this is something that the colleges often do have problems with, because as we opened up this session, they were designed for international students. So when I consult with community colleges about international students, there's two things that I often bring up to them. One is to increase or to initiate study abroad for US students. And many community colleges don't have those types of programs. And I also inform them of some of the scholarships that are available, again, through the US Department of State for study abroad, the Benjamin Gilmer scholarships, for instance. The second thing I offer when I talk with community colleges interested in recruiting community college international students is looking at capacity building grants. And again, there are capacity building grants from the US Department of State, $35,000 grants to help students expand and diversify student exchanges. So having student exchanges at the community college. These are new things that community colleges haven't participated in historically. But in terms of becoming more international, these are important steps that they need to take.
I was just going to jump in very quickly, and I'm going to put on my my professor hat as I teach finance in higher ed. So it all comes down to the money, right? But this will be very New England specific. So we have the most private residential colleges in the entire country, most of which don't have the name recognition that go to these other countries. And I'm telling you, as somebody who's gone to China a number of times, I cannot stress enough how brand recognition aligns very, very closely with I want to go there. So what do the rest of the colleges do? And one of probably the untapped resources is understanding the international education folks, are they working with the Career Center to really talk about what the career path of an international student could be if they come to study at your institution? So using those same outcomes that you would market to domestic students, you want to do the same for international students, because so many of them are coming here and then want to continue here for graduate work and want to eventually, be employed within the United States. And so if the Career Center folks don't understand what that journey could look like, it's a real missed opportunity. And when you engage international students in the Career Center and with those professionals, all of these other things that they really want to improve on, their speaking skills, their resume, things that they want to do, you get higher outcomes by doing that. So, we talk a lot about student affairs, and I mean, it's all important, right? But what is the career path for an international student is a huge marketing tactic for colleges and universities.
Great. Stafford, it looks like we have a question from Kara Godwin in the chat. Do you want to pose that, panelists?
Well, first of all, Rich, I think thanks for the promo for our third webinar, because we're going to dive into that topic on our third session on May 26th.
May 26th.
There we go. This is not a question, it's a comment made by Kara Godwin. And she's talking about the challenge of getting international students as part of their degree journey as having them participate as TAs or graduate instructors or even lab teachers. And I think that's a comment, but it's also a question from my perspective. How do you do it? How is it possible? What are the barriers? And how can you help those students surmount those barriers? And this is a question, I think, to all of you.
Well, maybe to jump in, I hope I will not present too unpopular a view, but I think sometimes we need to have these just sort of learning from experience. And I think first of all, I'm speaking from an experience, sort of having been a graduate student at public research universities that often rely on graduate students as teaching assistants. That has been my experience. And I really have to say, part of this is truly educating our US students about being familiar with different accents and different versions of English. For instance, certain research universities incorporated requirements for their teaching assistants in general, right? A graduate student who was admitted through a very selective process often is asked to teach, large, and often these are large sections of courses. It actually is not rare to have undergraduate students complaining about their TAs. And just like we know that teaching evaluations often measure, or rather often reflect biases around race, ethnicity, gender, and nationality of origin, teaching assistants are not excluded from these biases. And in fact, some institutions have introduced additional English, they're not really tests, they're sort of like English interviews for TAs, for doctoral students very often. And it's really puzzling, right? Because those requirements are not expected of US of US graduate students who are just sort of assumed to be not only or rather to be native speakers of English, but also to conform to a particular imaginary form of standard English, which we know does not exist. Ultimately, we all speak a version of English, a different accent and so on. So I think Kara is very correct that this is a huge challenge, but part of this goes back to this notion of it has to be on both fronts, right? Like we very often not only expect international students to assimilate to our culture, we also expect them to sound just like us. And I really think we need to confront these biases. We need to, and to be frank, some of these requirements, we're really responding to a very neoliberal customer satisfaction approach to say, oh, okay, you are not satisfied with the TAs that we have assigned. We are going to have some additional measure that is, first of all, vastly symbolic. Second of all, misguided altogether, right? And I really think these are some of the challenges that we are confronting, right? And it has to be disruptive, as Robin was saying earlier. We need to really shift the mindset that we have.
Well, Stephanie, I think we're at 2:00.
We are at 2:00. So to sign us off, we've covered so much ground today, and it's been, fantastic to hear from. I wonder if you could kick us off or send us off by leaving us with some closing thoughts on international student retention. We closed out the first session by leaving on a positive note. I'm wondering if you could leave us a closing note on a positive note on what New England institutions can do to make sure that international students have a positive experience. And we'll just go around again. Maybe we can start with Robin.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for this conversation. I think, really to Gerardo's point that he started with, and just picking up on the point that he just made, this is everybody together, and this is a two-way street. It's not expecting international students to adapt and do something. It's really about inclusion, and it's including everybody on campus. So I would just say that a truly inclusive approach means that we serve all of our students on our campuses and our communities and the world better. So just on a hopefully inspirational or well-designed by our public affairs team note, international student success is our success.
I would just lead with just that notion that over the past 4 years, our relationship with other countries has been strained, and that's not a political statement. It just is what it is. And higher education has a real opportunity that how we treat our international students is going to go a long way with healing some of those relationships with some of these other countries. So not only should we be doing this and doing the work as well as we could, but higher ed has a space right now. And so that could have real national and global implications if we take the time to do it well.
I think my closing comment is just going to be about the important work that members of our audience are doing. I was really excited to see so many practitioners who are either in strategic roles or in directly working with international students and with all students. And ultimately, it is your work that inspires the work that we do in conducting research, in trying to understand and inform some of this very important work that all of you are doing.
And I will sum it up by saying that it's been about 125 years that community colleges have served the U.S. as second chance and often only chance institutions for many Americans. In our era of openness and inclusion, it's time to offer and extend an invitation beyond our borders. I've seen community colleges change lives, and it does that for generations.
Perfect. That's a good note to end on. So thank you so much to our panelists. It has been fantastic to have you all with us, and we appreciate your time and your expertise today. As I mentioned at the start, we will be circulating the video of this meeting as well as the research that has been mentioned throughout this webinar in a post-event follow-up. I'll also include a link to the first webinar in case you missed that. We have gotten a few questions about that throughout the session, so I'll be sure to include that, and you can keep an eye out for that in the next few days. As Stafford mentioned, the third and final webinar in our series will be on international students' post-graduation success and workforce integration. It will take place Wednesday, May 26th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. It is sure to be another great conversation, so be sure to tune in. We'll include a registration link for that in our follow-up email. And you can sign up to continue to be part of the conversation with us. So thank you again to our panelists and to everyone who has joined us today. And we look forward to seeing you again on May 26th.